We are in a new paradigm, and 80% of healthcare is going to be automated within the next few years. How should we be thinking about where we are in 2025?
You can see in the technology where it is going to go and what it will be able to do. And an important piece of that as well is not just thinking about how can I use this to squeeze a few extra percent efficiency out of the existing system, which I think we all agree is a very broken system, but really using this as an opportunity from an R&D standpoint to look at these technologies and think, how can we completely re-engineer? How can we completely reimagine that care? And how can we get to a better healthcare system overall where we don't have access problems, where we don't have payment problems, where the unfairness and bias are not issues anymore, where it is evidence and data driven, right, in a real meaningful way.
Welcome to the Scale Healthcare Technology and Innovation Podcast, where we explore how innovative technology is revolutionizing U.S. healthcare. Hosted by Jason Schifman, president of Scale, we sit down with industry leaders to uncover the strategies, breakthroughs, and technologies shaping the future of care. Join us and subscribe as we dive into the cutting edge of healthcare innovation.
All right, welcome to the next episode of the Scale Community Technology and Innovation Podcast. I am pleased to be joined by Marc Paradis, the VP of Data Strategy for Northwell Holdings. Mark, welcome to the podcast.
Good morning, Jason. Thank you. Happy to be here.
So why don't we start off, maybe if you could just give a quick background. We're all familiar with Northwell as a health system, a large health system primarily based here in New York, 21 hospitals, over 900 outpatient facilities, providing care to more than 2 million patients per year, 5.5 million encounters per year. So quite a large health system. But within this Northwell umbrella, what specifically is Northwell Holdings?
So Northwell Holdings is one of the for-profit arms of Northwell Health. So we do direct venture investments, joint ventures, commercialization of internal innovation, data assetization, data partnerships, and data strategy.
Wonderful. So I want to begin with a question that we get from a number of our CEOs, which is a recurring theme of what is the role of technology in the future of healthcare? What is the role of AI in enhancing care delivery, enhancing back office operations and efficiencies? And, I think about the numbers that I just stated of 21 hospitals, 5.5 million encounters, and outpatient clinics. And, it feels like you must be a kid in a candy shop thinking about innovation, because you have this broad ecosystem that is really a wonderful incubator. And so if anyone has the answer to this question, it's got to be Northwell or the like. And so maybe can you give us a glimpse in terms of how Northwell as a health system is using technology, using AI to enhance patient care, to enhance back office operations today?
Sure. And I appreciate you starting off with a softball question, Jason. Large topic. I mean, look, certainly the core of our business is care and patient care and focus on that, but you really can't deliver care in any meaningful way without data. Even going back 50 or 100 or 150 years ago, you still had to have data in the form of notes, right? That the clinicians kept so that they could sort of remember who the patients were and lab results and all the rest of it. So data has always been an essential part of care, and in the same way that technology, right, has always been an essential part of care, at least for the last several hundred years. I mean, even going back to stethoscope, right, just kind of funny. You can go back and look at some of the early critics of the stethoscope who claimed that this was an invention that was going to get in the way in between the doctor and the patient and ruin the closeness of that relationship. And we see similar sorts of arguments being made today with respect to AI and technology. Sure, if inappropriately deployed or if set up not in the patient and the provider's best interest, it absolutely can get in the way and slow things down, right? And I think we've seen that to some extent with things like prior authorizations and a lot of the bureaucracy and paperwork, and the EHRs, the electronic health records, have been fantastic in terms of allowing us to capture and collect data as we never have before, but they also have introduced a very significant burden on the data entry side of things. So with all of that being said, a lot of what I do, and sort of when you think about data strategy, and a lot of what Northwell focuses on, is how do we actually use these technologies to enable? How do we use these technologies to bring the patient encounter back to the core of what it is, which is two humans working together, right, to generate health and longevity and happiness, right? And it's a challenging, very personal thing, right? When folks show up here or in any health system, right? It's a very vulnerable moment. Something is usually not right. They're concerned, oftentimes frightened, and there's really no technology, at least right now, right? They can replace that human touch there. But we really do think long and hard about what is the workflow, what is the process, where is the efficiencies, how can we make sure that the technologies that we're deploying are actually ending up in better care. And that's not just care as written by metrics, but also care as written by the experience of care.
And so where is Northwell Holdings focused in terms of its investment activity? Is it mostly on the care delivery side? Is it mostly you mentioned prior authorization? Is it mostly in the back office? What are the core areas that you focus on? And what are a couple of examples of where you've either built or invested in technology to advance the care delivery ecosystem?
Yeah, absolutely. Great question. Great point. So in general, or at least historically, our investment thesis has been based around finding either gaps in care within Northwell or areas of care which are not being advanced in ways that we would like to see within the medical community as a whole, and making investments in those areas to try to really push the field forward, right? In many ways, right? So whether that's investments in companies like Violet, which is, LGBTQ positive care, or whether it's investments in Brightline, which is, pediatric mental health and these sorts of things, very much focused on those areas which traditionally have perhaps been under-resourced or undervalued or underappreciated. Now, there's also a separate part of what we do, and this is, I think, where we're really leading the pack in some ways, right? So on the one hand, you could look at us as a very traditional corporate venture capital arm, but in many ways, we're very different from that, right? So traditional CVC usually goes out, raises a fund, makes a series of investments, looks for a return, right? Very much like a standard VC type of approach. In our case, we're much more mission driven, and we're looking to try to make investments that will actually move the needle. And so as part of that, we started a relationship about 6 years ago, officially announced it about 3 years ago, with a startup studio called Aegis Ventures. And the intent of that partnership was to take the best of a startup studio, right, and the best of a large IDN, right, integrated delivery network, right, and bring those two things together to really bend the curve and to make sure that all of the incentives were aligned. I think one of the challenges when you have a sort of a traditional VC type of fund or VC type of mindset is it's very focused on the return, like on the cash return, even when it's coming from a nonprofit health system, right, where you're trying to focus on it. There's still, it's just kind of in the DNA, and we wanted to make sure that the investments that we were making and how we're sort of moving things was focused much more on care and on the patients and on the providers, with the thesis that if we do what's right by the patient and we do what's right by the provider, the returns will follow. And I think the performance that we've seen to date certainly bears that out. And so we had this amazing opportunity to partner with Aegis Ventures, as I was saying, right, and they really bring the best of a startup studio in terms of access to capital markets, in terms of building out management teams, in terms of actually getting companies up and started and off the ground. Whereas what we bring is what is our core competencies, which is around the subject matter expertise around care and care pathways and the workflows, the infrastructure to deliver care, which is critical, and then of course all of the data, right, that comes off of that infrastructure and off of that subject matter expertise. And so when we can bring these two things together, we can go and identify areas which are real problems, not only for Northwell, right, but for healthcare in general. And we can co-capitalize companies and make investments to go and address these, right, and then take those.
So you've really institutionalized the concept of Northwell as an incubator, the subject matter expertise from the healthcare side Northwell provides, both in the investment prowess and management it just provides in terms of existing as a venture capital incubator. What are some examples of technologies that have come from that marriage of the two sides?
Yeah, for sure. So two good examples, one on the clinical side and one on the back office side. So in the last 3 years, we spun out 3 companies, and I'll talk about 2 of them. So first one let's talk about is a company called Ascertain. And so the goal of Ascertain is to leverage these agent-based frameworks that are sort of the generation 2 or version 2 of generative AI, and use these to go and automate back-end process in a meaningful way to reduce the burden, make healthcare more efficient, and, in general, lower that burden that exists. And so the first area that we looked at with respect to this was prior authorizations, and in particular, prior authorizations with respect to discharges to skilled nursing facilities and long-term care facilities. And it really is an amazing thing when you see it up and running and working, these agents, right? And so just so people understand, I think we're all familiar with ChatGPT, these large language models, and we can have these chatbot type interactions with them, and they can write papers for us, and it's amazing. But you can also take those large language models and you can give them agency, right? You can allow them to take actions in your system, search the web, interact with other systems that you have, enter data, extract data, all these sorts of things, right? Process that data and move on. And so the way that this works is as a patient is moving towards discharge, it kicks off a process where the first agent goes out to a rules engine and it knows for that patient who the payer is and what the plan is, and it pulls out the rules associated with the prior auth, passes those rules over to a SQL agent, which then is able to go out to all the various systems across Northwell. And it's not just SQL. Sometimes it's an API and sometimes it's a screen scrape, whatever it needs to interact with those systems. Pulls all of that data back together to make sure that, to satisfy that rule set, gets passed over to a QA agent, which goes and makes sure that that data is conformant, right? So if the field is supposed to be, gender, and it comes back with a blood pressure, right? It says, the agent says no, try, go to it again, goes back out and finds it. And then when it has that information, it actually writes the prior auth, sends it automatically via an eFax. And when the frequent denial comes back, right, it kicks off a chatbot conversation, right, between the insurance company and our chatbot. And if they can resolve the issue, right, so it's like, well, you had height and weight, but you didn't put BMI in. Great, right? The agent goes and writes that back into the rules engine, regenerates the prior auth, and out it goes. And it's really an amazing system and very, very robust, right? Unlike, RPA, robotic process automation, right? Where it's very fixed to the format of the inputs. Fields can move around on forms, APIs can change, all these sorts of things can change. The agents can adapt in real time to that. You don't need to reconfigure or reprogram.
Is the technology also helping with responding to the denial, or is it just using the information and intelligence from the denial to improve the prior authorization process going forward?
Well, so what we have seen is it is reducing our denial rates, right? So it's shortening the time to submission. We've seen cases where for some of these prior auths, it would take a human more than an hour, right? And the prior auth can put that together in under 10 minutes, right? Or the agents can put that prior auth together in under 10 minutes. There's still human interaction. There's still a couple of points along the way where the humans have to check in, and there's still some, it's not magic, and it doesn't do everything. But going from 60 minutes to 10 minutes, right? Seeing your denial rates drop significantly. And again, you have to remember is that, it's kind of nice because to some extent, this is a little bit of a low stakes environment in the sense that if you get the prior auth wrong or the rules wrong, it just means you have to go back and resubmit, right? Or worst case, if the agents can't work it out, a human has to get on the phone with a human, which is kind of what happens right now anyway in the existing system. So, and once you figure out what the correct rule set is, for the next patient who comes along for that payer, for that plan, right, you now have the correct rule set and it flows right through. And actually is another piece of that, the insurers, whether it's sort of quarterly or yearly, will send out these policy changes, right? And it's just PDF after PDF. And historically, we've had humans read through those. We can now actually have these agents read through those, pull out the rule sets entered into that rules engine. And so we're able to respond much more quickly. And that has also reduced the denial rate significantly.
And where are you in the rollout of this Ascertain technology to the Northwell system? Is it pilot? Is it pervasive across the entire system?
It's in production. It is not across the entire system yet. And in part, that's because we are reworking and centralizing our prior auth processes, right? So we've got some change going on there. And also we're in the midst of a migration from Allscripts as our EHR to Epic and migrating from Azure to GCP as our enterprise cloud. So we've got a lot of moving parts. But that's actually kind of cool that even in a system where we've got all of these moving parts and these major initiatives going on, we're still able to do these types of innovations. We're still able to actually get new systems into production that are having a meaningful impact on the backend processes. And so we're also looking at things like 3B audits, other prior auth use cases, some supply chain work. There's an enormous number of opportunities to optimize backend.
I know you mentioned a clinical application as well, which I want to get to in a moment, but just to give a sense for those thinking about implementing the technology on things like prior authorization back office. Give us a sense for the timeline of, from idea to development to pilot to full implementation, notwithstanding the change in EMR, but if you were to just kind of draw a timeline map of what this looks like.
No, it's fascinating. And thanks for asking that question. So we all, for those of us who've been in the field for a while, right, we all have in our head these waterfall notions and agile, and that it takes months to develop software and that it's enormously sort of time consuming and takes a lot of people. And as we move into these more generative AI and agentic systems, it's actually orders of magnitude simpler and more straightforward. So the idea when we first sort of connected with Ascertain, right, we did a grand tour of Northwell in the very various service lines and sort of talked to everyone about, well, what are your problems? What are your challenges? Where might this technology apply? And we went around, the various administrative departments. And one of the early use cases we came to was prior auth, which again, many people have seen the value and potential of agents in this space. Then that started a whole legal process, right, where we had to go back and make sure that the SOWs and so that took, 5-6 months. Then there was a whole process just to get the networks configured and, make sure we had the correct whitelisting. And, because we were deploying in Kubernetes, it was a whole thing. So that was another 3 months, right, to do that. When we got down to the actual coding, right, that was 2 developers for 2 to 3 months. Let's just say 3 months, 2 developers for 3 months to go and get to a production deployed agent-based application that was functioning in the real world and providing value. And like, if you think about that kind of scale and speed for a minute, that moment, that means, if you have a team of 20 developers, right, over the course of a year, right, you're going to get whatever that is, 40 of these systems kind of up and running. I mean, that's kind of crazy to wrap your head around, that with a team that size, you can have that kind of an impact in that short of a time.
Now that the product is developed, if Ascertain goes out to the next health system, are we talking about a very compressed timeline, or do they sort of have to go through all of the same process that Northwell went through on its initial rollout, from the governance to the legal to the development and implementation?
Yeah, the legal and the networking you can't get around, right? And different health systems have different runways, how long it takes to get through those. But that's always sort of the most challenging part. But again, the beauty of the agents is their flexibility, and that they really do almost behave like humans, right? And they're much more flexible. And you just need to have the data access protocols, right? And you simply tell the agent how to access the data, and off it goes and does its thing, right? And so, you don't really need to rewrite that QA agent, right? You don't really need to rewrite the rules, the agent that goes and, pulls the rules from the rules engine, right? The only place where you need to, and you don't even really need to rewrite that SQL agent. You just need to make sure that you've given it access to the correct systems, right, to hold the data that it needs. So it's a significantly accelerated time frame, as we're starting to see at other customers where we're getting bigger.
So let's move over to the clinical side. I think that's a good case study on the non-clinical back office. You mentioned that there was an application on the clinical side. We'd love to hear about that.
Yep. So on the clinical side, we spun up another company called Optane, and what Optane has done is they've built a device, a camera. It's about the size of I like to say it's about the size of a Star Wars binoculars, right? If you sort of remember from the Star Wars movies. And as a patient, you look into it, right, and it'll scan the back of your retina and give you diabetic retinopathy risk. It can also do cardiovascular risk for various cardiovascular conditions. Can also give you risk for certain neurological conditions as well. That in and of itself, right, is perhaps not that exciting. I think the first diabetic retinopathy deep learning model came out from Google in like 2016. It's a common thing that I think is done in a lot of AI courses these days. What is different and what sort of makes this stand apart is that we've integrated those two together, that the AI actually sits within the device. The device does not require a trained operator. Any human can lean over and look in, right? We spent a lot of time working on the human factors and that sort of design for different facial configurations, different body habitus, right? Different conditions that an individual might have. Like in some cases, for some individuals, it can actually be very hard to lean forward, right? And so we've really engineered the entire system to be as easy and as broadly accepting as possible. All of the processing is done internally. So one of the things you'll see in a lot of the other competitors is that data has to go up to the cloud and it's got a round trip going back and forth. And so this ends up being very nice, very compact, integrated into your EHR. And you can put these in your primary care offices, which is really the use case here, because there's now some quality metrics and reimbursement metrics around how PCPs are taking care of their diabetic populations, in particular with respect to diabetic retinopathy. And you don't need to train new nurses. You don't need a large equipment that has to take up, very precious space in your primary care office. I mean, it really is. It's a great tool, and one of the nice things about it is it falls into an area with respect to FDA regulation, right? That we can do with a 510K, and we don't have to do the whole sort of novel submission, right? Which is there's an amazing number of things we could do in the clinical space and that we want to do, but because of the way that the regulatory process is laid out, a lot of the more revolutionary things will take 5 to 10 years just to work through the process and do the correct study studies. And that's fine. We have work like that that's being done. But part of the intent with Aegis and Northwell, right, was to go and create companies that could provide value and have an impact on care in 12 to 18 months rather than, 5+ years.
Talk to us about the difference between Ascertain on the development timeline and Optane on the clinical side in terms of developing and rolling this out. Did it feel very different, or was
Yes.
So
Yes.
the key differences?
Yeah, very, very different. A much longer timeline, right? So on the Ascertain side, right, we did some work to go and build out our own custom agent-based framework, sort of based on LangChain and some of these other ones, but to allow us to have more flexibility and swap different models in and out to make sure we got the best price per performance or performance per price sort of thing. Again, all done very, very quickly. Like the actual coding work, start to finish, was 3 months, like I said, for two developers. On the Optane side of the world, the initial technology actually came out of a company based in Australia that we had connections with, right? And we acquired the worldwide rights to that technology, and then helped really commercialize that and bring that to the U.S. market. And so there were years of research that had existed prior to us acquiring those rights. And we are still not in production yet. We're in production in the sense that we can build the devices, right? And we've got them out there, but we are in the middle of one of sort of the early stage FDA trials right now. We've gone through all sort of the human factors design, and we did all of that work. But it's a years long process as opposed to a months long process, and it's clinical, and so that's as it should be. But I do think one of the things I would like all of your listeners to maybe think a little bit about is, while do no harm is absolutely the center of everything, and we should be very careful and very rigorous in how we assess these new tools and these new technologies, there is also a cost to not rolling these technologies out, right? There are life-saving technologies out there right now that are not approved and cannot be put into practice. That I've had some personal experience in my own family with this, where, if those devices, if that technology had been available, harm would have been avoided, right? So do no harm doesn't only mean not doing anything. Right. Do no harm sometimes means actually doing something. And so I would love for everyone to have a sense of urgency about this. For every day that we do not get a safe, effective AI tool or implementation out there is a day that is potentially we're doing harm to those patients who don't have access to that platform.
I want to spend more time on that. I think the topic of governance around the rollout is fascinating, and we spend a lot of time with CEOs thinking about that. How do you build a culture? How do you build guardrails and parameters for rolling these things out? But I have one more question before we get to that. And sure. So it's interesting, when we hear about technology, a lot of times it falls into the non-clinical and the clinical. And the non-clinical looks a lot like what you described in prioritization, process automation, maybe using AI to contribute to the process automation and make it more intelligent, but repeatable task intelligence, whether it's analytics or process automation. And then on the clinical side, a lot of times it falls into some form of imaging where AI is enhancing the findings. And so augmenting the people-only view of the images to get better insights into whatever the imaging is, whether it's a full body scan, whether it's a retina scan, whether it's a brain scan. When I think about Northwell, I think about this massive portfolio, and I think about all these disparate, probably silos. I'm sure they collaborate in some form, but your cardiology department, your primary care department, your neurology department. And I would think that there must be a treasure trove of data and insights that comes from mining that ecosystem, making all sorts of connections between what's driving better outcomes, what's driving higher cost, what's driving better adherence to protocols, so on, and patient engagement, so on and so forth. Is Northwell, directly or with your venture studio partner, thinking about that from the sort of AI intelligence perspective, or on the clinical side, are you primarily focused on the Optane type solutions that are enhancing the clinical care within a given specialty, mostly focused on imaging?
Well, my favorite answer is D, all of the above. But yes, more specifically, look, I mean, we're like anybody else. We have silos. We've sort of grown by mergers. We started off as 2 hospitals 20 plus years ago, and now we're 21 hospitals, and hopefully soon to be more. And it was a relatively light touch integration as we did that. And that's a large part of the justification for this migration to Epic, is to begin to break down some of those silos, to begin to create more common workflows, and to allow us we've done an amazing job of creating a true healthcare system and sort of a sense of systemness across this. But it could be and will be better as we move to Epic. And so that will help us break down a lot of those barriers. But I think another thing you touch on, which is is very exciting, at least for me, right, and my team, is we're working on right now what we call these next generation data assets. And that's where we're really trying to think about how can we create these data assets, or the data assets of the future, right, that will enable care at a new level, right, clinical care at a new level, and that really will be able to take advantage of the sorts of things that generative AI does best, right? And so one of those, for instance, is what we call dynamic data, which is streaming data, mostly from clinical consumer grade wearables, as well as bedside monitors, EKGs. And so really building out that data set and that data asset. Multiomic data, which is not just genomic, right? So gene sequencing, but is also transcriptomics, proteomics, metabolomics, all of these other aspects of life and cell biology. And then what we're calling robotic data, right? Which is a lot of video data basically around surgeries or other sorts of things. And as we're building out these, we're being very careful to not build them as silos. And that was part of the justification, right? We had existing projects in each of these areas already going on, and there was a concern that they're each going to be siloed and not really talking to each other. And so part of what it means to build these out as assets is to make sure that they are integrated and they can talk to each other, and they integrate into the electronic health record and the data lake houses that we have, and all of this type of stuff, to really have a unified view of the patient. Sort of like when you go to a financial services institution, right? If you do your banking at the same place that you have your insurance, right, at the same place, that you've got your investment portfolios, you would expect them to know about all of those things regardless of who you called. And I'm sure we all remember 20 years ago, those were disconnected and they didn't know each other, right? And so sort of in the same way that the financial services industry has made that transition, we're making that transition as well within healthcare. But when you start to think about these data sets, these are enormous data sets, massive data sets, and they have thousands upon thousands of dimensions. There's no way any human can wrap their head around these things. So for instance, you think about an EKG, and there's no clinical relevance to this, but it makes the point. AI can tell whether that EKG, right, that heart trace, came from a man or a woman, right? It just shows the level, it makes the point, the level of signal that must be in an insight that must be in all these data sets and data assets. And the only way you can really unlock that is with a tool like AI, which by its very nature can think in thousands of dimensions, right? Can analyze in thousands of dimensions and can help summarize and give insights in a way that no human will ever be able to do. Right? And so, we're really focusing on, she said, not only the imaging, we're doing a lot of work in the imaging space for sure, but we're also trying to push into some of these other areas with AI and really start to see how can we begin to reimagine care? How can we begin to re-engineer care? And we want to do that very carefully. Obviously, we're not having these ideas and throwing them into the clinic, but it's and that's part of what I do within Holdings as separate from Northwell Health as a whole, right? Northwell Health is that part of why we make that separation is it gives us a little bit more ability to be experimental, to try these things out in the market, to see if there's a there. And part of what we're the trailblazers in some sense. We go out, we scrape our knees, we make our mistakes, and all of that lessons, all of that learning, we then pass over to the enterprise, right? And the enterprise then turns those into enterprise assets, enterprise capabilities. And it's really a nice synergy.
Let's spend a minute on governance. I mean, you mentioned the cost of moving too quickly. You mentioned the cost of moving too slowly. I would imagine there's no shortage of opportunities and ideas across the Northwell ecosystem. So how do ideas get surfaced? How do you filter through to decide what to prioritize? And from a quality rollout perspective, how do you think about rolling out new technologies in the Northwell health system?
Yeah, so ideas and innovation comes from all angles, right? We're sort of continually bombarded with them. A lot of them bubble up internally. We have incredibly bright, incredibly talented, incredibly innovative staff, whether that's clinical or administrative or whatever it might be, who are always thinking and experimenting and pushing and trying to solve problems. And so we get a lot of stuff that kind of bubbles up. And as a business line, we're relatively well known within the health system, so people know to come to us and sort of ask us some questions about these things. Because we also have this sort of corporate venture capital arm, we get a lot of companies coming in and bringing ideas to us, and we have a whole process we go through where we get over 1,000 inbound inquiries every year, and only 2 to 3 of them end up in an investment, maybe. A very rigorous due diligence process there. We've also got an innovation challenge, right, which we're in the middle of running right now, where we explicitly go out to the community and say, bring us your ideas and bring us your innovations. We've got a nice sort of standard form with a series of questions. And we've been doing this for about every 1 to 2 years for the last 5, 7, 8 years, something like this. We've been doing this for a while. But one of the things that was different this year about this process, which was super exciting, was we actually incorporated AI into the form. So it's not just like a dry web form where you have to type out, here's my idea and here's what the market value is and here's the TAM. And on the side of that form, you now actually had a privately hosted, privately tenanted version of Gemini, right? Which is, Google's large language model. And you could interact with it. You could ask it questions. I have an idea for a cardiac monitor of particular size, shape, device, whatever it is. What are the competitors for that, right? And you ask that question in a little side window, and it'll come back and it'll bring you a long list of people who are already in the market. What does the total addressable market look like? What is the service? What is the definition of a TAM versus a SAM, and how do I distinguish those, right? And it was really fantastic, right? We actually found, so we had upwards of 150 or 160 submissions. Of those 150 submissions, about 100 of them, so about 2/3 of them interacted with the AI while they were doing that submission. And on average, they interacted between 6 and 8 times with the AI. So it was and my favorite one was the person who put the question in for an innovation challenge. Give me an idea for an innovation challenge at a large IDN. Which actually, if that had been one of the ones that was selected and had won, you would think that would be one of the best arguments for AI ever. But anyway, so that's another way that we do it. And so it's a variety of different mechanisms. And then obviously we have the partnership with Aegis and Ascertain. And like we did, we're continually going out and pinging the service lines, the various heads of the business units and administrative lines, and trying to surface issues that they have. And sometimes when we see what we think are opportunities, we'll take those out to the subject matter experts and say, hey, is this really a problem? Is this worth fixing?
And when you think about evaluating the opportunities, I mean, some technologies reduce costs. I would imagine the prior authorization technology converts a manual process into an automated processing does a cost reduction. Some may focus on acquiring and retaining patients. Some may focus on expanding the scope of service to patients. Some may focus on reducing the total cost of care. Do you think about it in those buckets, and do you think about prioritizing one bucket or the other, or are you more, equal opportunity if it's a good technology that achieves any one of the above in any one of those areas? Northwell is potentially interested in moving forward.
So there is an aspect that we can't get around, right? Which is, you need to get paid to keep the lights on, right? And having this infrastructure to deliver care is enormously expensive, right? And we have this tremendously complicated healthcare system that we interact with payers and all the rest of it. And there's a lot of, free care that goes on as well, right? I mean, we don't turn anyone away. And so it's a very challenging financial environment to work through. And part of what that means is while there is enormous soft ROI that comes out of almost every AI implementation that I've seen, whether it was a back end or a clinical implementation, that's soft ROI gets lost in the complexity quite often. And it becomes very hard to judge, should we do this or should we not? Now, obviously, if it's a clinical imperative and you know that you can save lives with it and it's ready to, we'll do that, and we'll do that in a heartbeat. We've done that before with some of our technologies because it's the right thing. It's the right thing to do. But when it's a more nuanced, or you have to sort of make a choice between, here are two different things that we could do that bring equal benefit. How do we sort of bring equal non-monetary benefit? How do we assess which one we're going to do? And so it's much easier if you can find hard ROI to really grasp onto it. Again, I think that's part of the appeal of the back-end processes and the administrative processes is a very clear hard ROI associated with it, right? Very clear improvements in efficiency and throughput and denial rates and all the rest of it. And so you can very easily draw a straight line from the implementation. So that is one tool, but it is not the only tool, right? And it's not sort of something that we slavishly look towards, right? But it does help get the conversation started. It does help us then actually also go and build out the business model. How do we track this and make sure that it's delivering the impact that we think it will?
I want to finish up with one more general topic, sort of taking a step back and looking at the market and thinking forward. And I'm curious to get your perspective on where you think we are as a market, where you think we're going. So the first is, you mentioned technology's always been a part of healthcare and in different forms, whether it's the stethoscope, whether it's the EMR, or a number of other technologies that have been proliferated in our healthcare delivery ecosystem. All sorts of things are ranging from we are in a new paradigm and 80% of healthcare is going to be automated within the next few years. Then we also hear the other end of the spectrum of the new technology that's being experimented with is just mostly noise. Are we in a new paradigm today? How should we be thinking about where we are in 2025 relative to what we've experienced in the past, which is a progression of increasing technology adoption in the market? Is today different than what we've experienced previously?
Yeah. So in my opinion, it's absolutely different. I think we've moved from a world of linears into a world of exponentials, right? So if you sort of look at the history of technology, over the last several hundred years or whatever, it's largely been sort of straight line, largely very linear. You can kind of predict it out 3 to 5 years into the future pretty well. You can take the time to let someone else go out first and make the mistakes. And then once the technology is vetted and proved, you can throw a lot of people and money at it to catch up. But with these technologies, you look at the rate and the pace and the speed of change. Literally every week, there is a major new development within generative AI and I'm using generative AI broadly. So for the people who are, going to want to be sticklers about it, sure, there's the foundation models based on transformers and attention mechanisms, and that's sort of one thing. But there's also real world models. There's sort of robotic models that are out there, and a variety of other things. So I'm kind of clumping all of these together, and maybe can make a little bit of a distinction between sort of more deterministic AI, which is kind of like the very algorithmic AI that we've had to date, versus the more non-deterministic, right, which is called a generative. You can ask a chatbot the same question twice, and it'll give you slightly different or sometimes very different answers, right? And that's a strength and a weakness. But the rate at which this technology is changing, and every time someone comes up with here's a challenge, right? Oh, they're just a sophisticated parrot, or look at run out of data to train these things on, or the energy requirements. Pretty soon we're going to require the entire energy output of the sun to make any more. Every time one of these constraints is raised, within 3 to 6 months, it's pretty much technically solved, right? And that's a reflection of the worldwide investment, right, at a nation state level, right, as well as at the corporate level, to move these technologies forward. And so it's just different when you're in an exponential. If you wait if you wait for someone else to figure it out, right? If you're a day behind, you're a week behind. If you're a week behind, you're a month behind. If you're a month behind, you're a quarter behind. I know that math doesn't quite work out, but you get the point. And it doesn't matter how much people or money you throw at it, you're not going to catch up, right? The only way you can catch up in an exponential is to change the actual exponent. And that means you have to come up with a new technology, right? Which is really hard and costs a lot of money and it takes a lot of infrastructure. So I agree the technology is not ready prime time right now. Doctors have jobs for a long time. Administrators, humans will have jobs for a long time. But you can see in the technology where it is going to go and what it will be able to do. And an important piece of that as well is not just thinking about how can I use this to squeeze a few extra % efficiency out of the existing system, which I think we all agree is a very broken system, but really using this as an opportunity from an R&D standpoint to look at these technologies and think, how can we completely re-engineer? How can we completely reimagine that care? And how can we get to a better healthcare system overall where we don't have access problems, where we don't have payment problems, where the unfairness and bias are not issues anymore, where it is evidence and data driven, right, in a real meaningful way. This is all the promise of what's coming down the line.
We definitely see on the rate of development that there's rapid rate of development. The number of companies, the number of solutions, the number of sort of moving from, and the pace of moving from V1 to V2 of the products there's a lot of activity going on. And then you contrast that with the rate of adoption on the operator side, on the company side, and there's a disconnect between the two. Yeah. Yeah. Which I think makes sense, right? I mean, that makes sense for where we are in our stage of this new paradigm. Yeah. Where would how far away are we from a point of inflection where the rapid pace of development starts to align with more rapid pace of adoption? Are we a year away, 5 years away, 10 years away, or it's just too hard to predict it, and maybe those two paths never intersect? So I think that technology will be ready and that level of capability within the next 3 to 5 years. I think the structural inertia of society and regulation and the way that things have been done for so long will put us more into the 10 to 15 year timeframe before we really see it permeate. And there will be some parts of society where we'll see it tear through very, very quickly, like in the next 18 months, just because, and so not healthcare, right? But there are some parts of industry and business which are just ripe for this, right? And I know of several, all the tech companies have said this quite vociferously over the last 6 to 12 months, like, they're not hiring any more software engineers. The level, right? Because again, a lot of these LLMs, especially when you put them in these agent-based frameworks, right, can write code as good as a junior or mid-level software engineer. Now, it's not a human; it can't do it on. It needs to be in its own. So it needs to be in a framework, and there has to be humans overseeing it and all the rest. But once you set that up, again, that's the reimagining or the re-engineering, right, of the process. I know people who have literally gone and set this up. They let it run, and 24 hours later, they have 300,000 lines of code that is fully tested and fully documented. Like, that's the scale of change that we're looking at. And that doesn't necessarily mean we have less programmers, but it means each programmer is now doing a lot more, and all of these things that we couldn't previously do, we now can. That 10 to 15 year horizon for the practical full adoption of this technology, do you draw a distinction between non-clinical, patient-facing, non-clinical, I call it non-clinical and clinical operations, or do you think it's a 10 to 15 year across all three of those?
The non-clinical stuff will change faster and more quickly, right? Because it's lower stakes, right? If you get it wrong, people's lives aren't at risk. You're not risking permanent harm to an individual or a family or a community by doing that. So I think you'll see adoption there, and I think over the course of 25 and 26, a lot of health systems will start playing around with these agent-based approaches to automating the back end. And once they run a couple of POCs and they see the orders of magnitude improvement they can get on the other side, it'll very quickly become a mandate to just automate the entire non-clinical back end as much as possible. The clinical side, we do need to move more carefully on. We do need to move with more thought and care. And I do think there's a series of really sort of grown-up conversations we need to have as a society and as a species around how we think about AI, how we regulate AI, how we bring it, especially this new type of AI, right? How we bring that into our and those are non-trivial questions that not everyone is going to agree on, right? And that's okay. We'll get there, and those are conversations we'll have, and I think that's appropriate for those higher stakes types of clinical decisions.
You mentioned about sort of the tangible ROI is always easier to get excited and rally around than the softer ROI. In the pilots that you've run so far, how happy are you with the tangible ROI?
I mean, so to be fair, this has been a process, right? If you had talked to me 3 years ago, I would not have said the same things we say now, right? So we made a lot of mistakes. We tried to push on the soft ROI side. We actually had some great deals and some great opportunities, but they just didn't quite line up. And so it's now at this point in time, I think we have a much more sort of nuanced understanding of this and an ability to kind of roll it out. And that, so when we look at it from that way, for these back-end non-clinical processes, the hard ROI that's coming out of them is tangible, it's quantifiable. It allows us to take the existing staff that we have and make them more efficient, more productive. It allows us to upskill people and take them away from sort of the drudgery of having to go to 5 different systems to go and check is someone a smoker or not a smoker, right? Like we can have that largely automated, or at least bring that information together to them. And so it really, even though this is a non-clinical application, to some extent, it allows humans to be more human. It allows you to use your brain more and interact and think and use more of what makes us thinking apes rather than just apes.
I want to finish up with one final question is relating this experience at Northwell to other specialty MSOs in the market that don't have the scale of Northwell. When I think about, again, back to the 5.5 million encounters, the infrastructure you have with 85,000 employees, I imagine there's a large IT team internally, the large data team internally, the partnership where you've, worked with a venture studio to collaborate and leverage sort of the best of both sides of the equation. The $19 billion operating budget that Northwell has, there's a lot that Northwell has that goes into allowing your role at Northwell Holdings to be feasible and to be patient through the development process as you go through the experimentation and the iterations. Do you see at this stage of where we are in the market, piloting these types of technologies is really for the larger players like a Northwell, or do you see and believe that players that are, maybe a tenth the size of Northwell, that are single specialty in focus, that those players should be just as focused as Northwell is? And how do you compare and think about the strategies for, how Northwell might approach it versus how one of those other leaner players would focus in this strategy?
This is a great point, and you put your finger on a really important problem. I might get the numbers slightly wrong, but I think it's something of the 3,000 or so hospitals in the U.S. Right, 2/3 of them are small systems, 2, 3, 4 hospitals, regional, maybe a critical access hospital thrown in there, something, community rural hospital. And so we do have the luxury, right, of being a large system with a lot of it, and also we're in the urban Northeast, right, which is very different from being in the rural South, right, or the upper Midwest. That is actually one of the things I've been thinking a lot about over the last sort of year or two. Is that's a different kind of access and inequity, right, issue that ultimately, bubbles down to the patients themselves, who might find that they have to travel 30, 40, 50 miles, right, to get to a specialist. Here in New York, right, I can throw a rock from my window and I can hit every specialty I think there is. And so that's a challenge. But I think one of the things that there's a part of the answer to that question is I also think the partnership with Aegis and spinning out companies like Ascertain allows us to package these applications up in a way that we can make them affordable and deployable and implementable at small smaller systems, right? And we can begin to maybe address some of that, right? But I think there's also another way to look at it is, why do we have to have the system that we have, right? Are there ways that we can actually sort of break open some of the geographical barriers, right? So just run with me for a minute, right? And imagine that we've got a Dr. Chat GPT, right? That has, you give it authorization to have access to your medical records. You give it through TEFCA, right? The sort of national act that allows the HIE and Health Information Exchange. So it's gathering all your health data, puts it all in one place. You also interact with it, sort of a friend and a coach and a mentor, so it knows what's in your cabinets, it knows what you ate last night, and can do all of these things. And so now it can be running all sorts of algorithms in the background, right? And at some point in time, you're going to cross some threshold, and it'll say, hey, you've now crossed the threshold. You're pre-diabetic. You need the following 2 prescriptions, and according to the American Heart Association guidelines, the American Diabetes Association guidelines, right, and Northwell guidelines, you need the following 2 prescriptions and a referral. And that's now something that you can be anywhere in the country and have that level of service, assuming you've got appropriate bandwidth and connectivity, which is another challenging issue to get through in some areas. But and that could still be Northwell branded, and you could still have Northwell telehealth visits behind it. And again, I get there's a ton of other issues, right? You need some blood work to do these things. So again, this is more visionary, not actually lay this out. But you look at the capabilities of the tools and the technologies today. Each and every part and piece of this actually already exists in some pilot form or production form. It just needs to be strung together into a new method of care and delivery.
I think it's a great point. I increasingly think that the solution to a lot of the problems and challenges in healthcare exists in the market. And so it's not about necessarily innovation from a new service line technology perspective. It's actually about connecting the dots to get patient to the right place for what they need. And so when you get into it, excellence within any given area is quite intricate, and it's hard to be everything and excellent all at the same time in those sub-disciplines. And so, for example, orthopedics, true excellent care, high quality, appropriately cost care, there's an entire stack within that ortho MSK spectrum that's required. And unless you really live and breathe that every day, I do wonder whether it's how feasible it is to get to, everything from the physical therapy to the orthopedic specialty ASC to the orthopedic specialty care coordination. And you can make that same point in all the specialty markets, whether it's, cardiology or nephrology, the list goes on. And so where I think there is an opportunity for technology to play a paradigm changing role is sort of in the direction where you're saying, in terms of linking up these coordinating across these pockets of excellence to allow for the best of each of these areas to be delivered. And it's complicated because to do that and still maintain the Northwell brand, requires, again, there's a lot of moving pieces that sit beneath it, but that is where I think I'm excited to see how technology can play a role in bringing together these centers of excellence in their respective areas.
Absolutely agreed, right? And just sort of one last note on that. I think we have a comparator problem, and a lot of these studies we're using the wrong comparator. We'll have an algorithm that'll diagnose or do something, and we'll compare it against the 20 best clinicians at the peak of their career, right? And the AI will do better than 18 of them, right? It'll do the same, or 17 of them do the same as 2 of them, and there'll be 1 doctor, right, that does better than the AI. And we say that's inappropriate. We can't put that into production. And I think what we need to be thinking is, for any given clinical decision, so long as the AI is better than 50.1%, and I'm not saying we're going to deploy this, I'm just making a intellectual argument here. So long as that AI is better than 50.1% of the clinicians who would be making that decision in real life, on average, you're now getting better population health outcomes than you were before. And for every percentage point improvement beyond that, it's just icing on the cake, right? And so again, I'm not saying we should be rolling out, 50.1% after, but I'm saying we come up with a lot of excuses to not deploy technology. We come up with a lot of excuses to delay the deployment of technology, rather than looking at, not everybody, has access to the healthcare infrastructure and the expertise that exists in New York or Chicago or LA or San Francisco, right? Or Miami. Right? As we were talking about, there's large parts of the country we just don't have access to that. And so if you can be delivering care that is 75th percentile, 80th, 90th percentile, which a lot of these algorithms can do that, that's probably significantly better than what they're getting now. And I'm not saying that should replace doctors, but that should be a tool that the doctors that they have, that human interaction that they have, that doctor can be providing that much better care.
therein lies the 10 to 15 year prediction versus the 3 to 5 prediction, because there's obviously a lot of complexity that goes into that. But point duly noted and agreed. Mark, I really want to thank you for the time. It's been an informative discussion, and I appreciate all the insights to what you're working on at Northwell Holdings. And
Thank you, Jason. It was a pleasure.
all right, take care.